Today is the 9th of July 2005. I'm in Mali, in West Africa, where I've come to see the biggest mud building in the world. The great Mosque of Jenne, an astonishing sight. Driving up here yesterday, the mobile phone rang, and I heard that 7 bombs had exploded in London that morning. Hundreds were injured, scores were dead, the handiwork probably of Al-Qaeda. Among the stations that were bombed was the one my daughter uses to go to school. I spent a horrible couple of hours battling with lousy phone connections, finding out she was all right. You think dark things at moments like that, and I fretted about this film. Was it right to be making it? It's about the wonders of Islamic art, but was that still an appropriate subject? I knew the answer long before I arrived here and saw that. I had just spent months and months crisscrossing the Islamic world, and everywhere I'd been, I'd seen fascinating and beautiful things. Some of the most fascinating and beautiful things I had ever seen, made by fascinating, beautiful people who had never shown me anything but kindness, friendship, and hospitality. Not to have made this film would have been utterly dishonest. There's something over there I wanted to show you. We're coming at it from an unusual angle from the back, but you'll recognize it straight away when you see it. It's a beautiful example of Islamic art. Perhaps the most beautiful example of all. Rather like a typical Islamic work of art, the real story of Islam is sparkling, fascinating, complicated, and gorgeous. And the best way to tell it is not with scary interviews and politics. That's just news. The winds of time will blow all that away. The truest evidence that any civilization ever leaves behind about itself is its art. Art never lies. It didn't lie about the Greeks, it didn't lie about the Romans, and it certainly doesn't lie about Islam. Ah, the Taj, the Taj. The most beautiful building in the world? Of course it is. So beautiful and so Islamic. There are various stylistic features to enjoy about the Taj that make it typically Islamic. The love affair that's going on here with simple, gleaming geometry. No other religion has ever trusted geometry as profoundly as this. This sense of perpetual decoration, of saying it with flowers. And all this sensuous calligraphy, words turned into art, quotations from the Quran, an Islamic speciality. But there's something else, something that unites all Islamic art from nation to nation across the centuries like a super glue. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it the atmosphere of paradise. You can see what I mean immediately. It's that air of delicate, God-given perfection, of dreams fulfilled and divine tranquility. It's unmissable and so desirable. How Islam developed this addictive appetite for paradise, when, where, and why it was developed is quite a story. It's our story. Islam emerged in some of the world's hottest and least hospitable places. Its creators were desert people. Its moods were desert moods. And to get a feel for its art, I suggest we consider the desert dweller's relationship to an oasis. Islam has its own calendar. Day 1 of this calendar marks the departure of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam's founder, from Mecca, where he was born, and his arrival at the oasis of Medina, where he settled and built himself a very significant house. The Prophet didn't select the exact spot for his new house himself. He left the choice to his camel, which, guided by Allah, stopped at some open land owned by 2 orphaned brothers. The Prophet purchased this land, and on it he built his new dwelling. When asked to explain this simple choice, he said, "A man is where the saddle of his camel is." The land had some palm trees on it, which Muhammad cut down, and he marked out a typical Arabian dar, a walled courtyard made of mud bricks, much like these, except a lot bigger. It was square, 50 metres by 50 metres, and it had these humble dwellings along the edges, and the walls were about 10, 11 feet high, like these are. On the edge of the courtyard, the Prophet built some huts for his wives. Modest mud brick structures with palm roofs. At the centre, he dug a well. And later, when his followers complained of sitting in the exposed sun, he gave them shelter, a simple portico of palm tree columns covered with palm leaves. The first mosque. Every mosque that came afterwards is descended architecturally from this simple, rustic arrangement of the Prophet's house in Medina. And there's something else that the house in Medina bequeathed to all subsequent mosques, and that's its communal air. These Middle Eastern courtyards have so many roles. It's where the animals are tethered, it's where the washing's done, it's where food is cooked. It's where the Prophet preached to his followers, and where sometimes the followers would stay overnight in the shade of the portico. And this sense of a community going about its business behind protective walls was another of the great gifts to the future of the Prophet's dwelling. The mosque began its marvellous and busy history, not as a temple or a daunting place of worship, but as a home. Originally, at prayer times, the community would turn to pray in the direction of the holy city of Jerusalem. But then, one momentous night, the angel Gabriel came to the Prophet in a dream and showed him Mecca. He actually saw the city through a miraculous gap in the vista. And from that moment, the orientation of every mosque was changed and turned to Mecca. The direction of Mecca is marked by the mihrab, a niche in the Qibla wall. Sometimes simple, sometimes gorgeous, sometimes plain, sometimes filled with the flowers of paradise. But the mihrab is always turned to Mecca. So let's see, there's paleontology, and then archaeology, sociology. There we go, the map room. A medieval map of the Islamic world. It's pretty accurate. But can you see where you live on it? No. That's because in these medieval maps of the Islamic world, north and south are the other way round. North is at the bottom and south is at the top. But if I turn this upside down, it all becomes more familiar. There's Italy, Sicily, the Mediterranean. There's Spain, North Africa. And Islam began on the Arabian Peninsula here, where Muhammad was born in Mecca in around 570 AD. That's 570 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. But this brand new religion spread across the world at an astonishing speed. Within a century, the Islamic Empire stretched from Spain over here, all the way across North Africa, through Central Asia, right up to the Chinese borders. It was the most explosive expansion that any religion had ever mounted. At first, with all this conquering going on, there wasn't much time for art. But that changed when the Islamic capital was moved from Mecca here southwards, or northwards as we'd call it, to this great city here. Damascus, the world's oldest inhabited city, they say, and one which used to be notoriously beautiful. Today, the entire city has turned to face an electronic Mecca, called to prayer by the satellite dish. But in less trashy times, Damascus worshipped better deities with more glorious consequences. It's written that Muhammad, on a trip from Mecca, got as far as the outskirts of Damascus, and then he stopped. He refused to go any further. When asked why, he explained that man should only enter paradise once, and that one time was on the day he died. Famed internationally for its luxuries and its fertility, Damascus was such a desirable oasis, so full of many precious things, that everybody wanted it. The Phoenicians were here, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, Christians, they all lent Damascus their ear. And right here, there was a pagan temple to the Aramaean god Hadad. Now that was taken over by the Romans. See the Corinthian columns there, and that large chunk of pediment. That's what's left of one of the largest temples to Jupiter in the whole of the ancient world. And it looked rather like that. See here, the entrance gate where the columns still are, and there in the middle, the sanctuary where the famous statue of Jupiter stood. When the Romans converted to Christianity with Constantine, when the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire, this became a Christian church, a basilica, in which were preserved some very precious relics, because it was said that buried here was the head of John the Baptist. And when the Muslims conquered Damascus, around these precious remains was built this huge mosque. For nearly a century after they arrived here, Muslims shared this space with Christians. The Christians would worship at the west end here, and Muslims would worship at the east end. It was a working religious timeshare. But eventually, the caliphs, Muhammad's successors, who had moved their capital from Mecca to Damascus, realized they needed a place of worship of their own. And so here, on the former temple of Jupiter that had become a Christian church, they set about inventing the Islamic mosque. The land was actually purchased from the Christians who owned it by the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid I, for whom money was never an object. His mosque was built in a decade at stupendous expense. 7 years of taxes from the whole of Syria were spent on it before it was finished in 715. Not only is it the earliest surviving mosque, but to this day it remains amongst the most spectacular. The chief treasures of this Damascus mosque are its mosaics in twinkling glass and gold. There's been so much argument about what the golden walls are showing us. What is this fantastic architecture imagined here? Where are these rivers? Where are those trees? Some say these are perfect evocations of Damascus itself, beautified and watered. Others believe the mosaics represent the Muslim conquests, that Al-Walid I was showing the world what Islam now possessed. Personally, I just don't believe any of that. This doesn't feel at all aggressively possessive, and it doesn't look anything like Damascus. What you feel with these luxurious trees, so bounteous and green, the rippling waters, the fantastic palaces, is a sense of somewhere perfect and peaceful, somewhere like paradise. This is what Muhammad wanted to see once and only once. Even the colours of those mosaics, that luscious green, the sumptuous gold, those are the colours described in the Quran of paradise. But look, there's no one there yet. No people, no animals. It's ready, but it's empty and waiting for us. All we have to do is lead the right life, do the right things, and follow the right God. I've seen wall-to-wall imaginings of paradise like these before in Buddhist fresco cycles. If you go to India or China, and of course the traders of Damascus were famous for such travels, you'll find painted caves filled with visions of paradise, with palaces, rivers, bridges, gold, trees. So Islam took all these ingredients, bits of the Christian basilica, pieces of the Roman temple, visions of paradise from the Buddhists, and it mixed them all together and came up with something completely unmistakable and Islamic, something the world had never seen before. Yet how clearly you sense here the basic arrangement of Muhammad's simple courtyard. A covered hall to shelter the faithful from the sun, a fountain at the centre to wash at and purify yourself, the sense of a meeting place to which everyone is invited. Having settled on this basic arrangement for its first great mosque, Islam liked it so much it stayed with it for 1,000 years and beyond. I wanted to show you this unusual structure. It's where the treasures of the mosque were kept, an early Islamic bank vault set high up on these Roman columns that don't quite fit. Now up here, look carefully, there's a sundial that was used to calculate the times of the call to prayer when every Muslim was expected to turn to Mecca. Now that's a very easy thing to say, at the call to prayer you turn to Mecca. But how exactly would somebody living in 8th century Damascus know where Mecca was? It's relatively easy here. Mecca isn't that far away. But what if you come from West Africa, from Timbuktu, or Samarkand in Central Asia, or Genghis Khan country? Well, you begin by inventing some helpful instruments like these. Astronomy, mathematics, geometry. Arabian science was far ahead of the West in all of them. And such exquisite instruments were fashioned by Islamic craftsmen to make simpler the difficult task of knowing exactly where Mecca was. The desert palace of Kirbat al-Mafha was probably built by Al-Walid II, the playboy of the Umayyads. This was his pleasure ground in the Judean desert, far from Damascus, where Al-Walid II could let his hair down, which he did. Al-Walid II was a famous lover of hunting, and this desert palace was built on the banks of a fertile wadi and was originally surrounded by a huge hunting park. Meanwhile, the insides leave you in little doubt that Al-Walid II enjoyed other pleasures too. Curvy and topless dancing girls, busty and brazen, lined the walls here to ceiling height and set a mood for the palace that was most unlikely. The desert palace had a special room for playing music, and this spectacular bathroom, which now hides a secret floor. So Haldun, you're in charge of the mosaics here, and when you walk into this space, which was the giant bath of the Caliph before, you don't actually see any mosaics on the ground, but if I rub the sand here, will I find mosaics?
Everywhere you will find the mosaic.
Can you show me?
Yeah. Because we covered.
The sand is protective sand, yeah?
Yeah.
To protect them.
Yeah, we put sand, and after that we put the soil.
I'll let you dig for a bit.
Yeah. So it's coming there.
Yeah, I'll rub this, yeah?
There is the leaf here. It's the sun.
So this is the famous scene here of the knife with the fruit. That's right.
I think now you can say you discovered something.
I discovered the lost fruit symbolism of the Umayyad caliphs. Well, it does look Very striking.
Uh-huh.
The knife,
Yeah.
the leaf representing the sun or paradise perhaps,
Uh-huh.
and this big juicy fruit. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
The most famous mosaic here is in the guest room,
Yeah.
where the Caliph would entertain his guests.
Yeah.
Can we
Yeah,
see that now?
Yeah, sure. Which is named by the tree of the life.
The Tree of Life.
Yeah.
The famous mosaic of the lion attacking a gazelle perhaps had an erotic context. The actual word, gazelle, which Arabic gave to English, is also the Arabic for love poetry. And since ancient times, mighty rulers of Al-Walid's type have thought of themselves as all-conquering lions. In Arabic poetry, and indeed in the poetry of Al-Walid II, for he was a poet too, the gazelle is invariably a female presence. With its big staring eyes and its long sensuous neck, it's a graceful animal equivalent of the beautiful virgins who await the good Muslim in paradise. Many people believe that figures are banned in Islamic art. Actually, they're not. Nowhere in the Quran does it say that an artist cannot depict or paint figures. What is frowned upon is the showing of idols in a religious context, and that's for obvious reasons. It's all down to the 10 Commandments. The second commandment, you may remember, says, "Thou shalt not make any graven image of anything that is on earth or on the sea below." And Islam, like Christianity, inherited that commandment from the Jews. Now, these three great religions, which all arose in the same place, have chosen to interpret this commandment in three different ways. Judaism has always frowned upon the making of any images. Christianity has always ignored the commandment. And Islam, well, Islam has swung this way and that way, depending on the fashion at the time. It looks as if it was Jewish converts to Islam who introduced this notion that images were taboo. Islam and Judaism, here and elsewhere, had so much in common. Above all, they shared this fierce antipathy to the ways of the Christians. But this distrust of images just wasn't there in the beginning, and it was never universal, though it did have the most potent implications. It led to a lot of abstraction. It led to new ways of understanding geometry. It led to a renewed faith in the Word. No one is certain where 1001 Arabian Nights was written. Probably here in Cairo. The atmosphere's certainly right. The streets here teem with rascals, smooth talkers and clowns. It's intoxicating, but also edgy. All religions attract conflict as well as stability. With destiny to play for, there's always room for differing opinions, and Islam is no different. The big split in Islam is between Sunni and Shiite. Someone once explained it to me as the equivalent in Christianity of the difference between Methodists and Catholics, with the Shiites as the Catholics. And it's true. Shiite art is usually more ornate and florid than Sunni. But sometimes It's the other way round. With Islamic art, you never quite know where the journey's going to finish. But the reasons for the Sunni-Shiite split are plain enough. It was a dynastic dispute, an argument over who should lead Islam. The Shiites believed only those descended directly from the Prophet himself, family members, could claim to be his successor. The Sunnis, meanwhile, insisted that caliphs should be chosen for their organizational talents, their suitability, not their bloodline. So, was it reason or emotion? The brain or the blood? This is the shrine of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson and son of Fatima, Muhammad's favourite daughter. Fatima was married to Ali, who was chosen as Caliph, one of Muhammad's successors, and then assassinated. His son, Hussein, went to war against the Sunni Umayyads to right this wrong, but he too was killed and his family murdered. Thus, blood entered the equation, lots of it, and in these parts, that's not quickly forgotten. The Shiites were marginalized by the Sunni caliphs and became the party of rebels and minorities. The disaffected turned to them. They were the Robin Hoods of Islam and learned to be utterly ruthless. Fated to remain a minority in the early Islamic world, the Shiites only claimed one major territory for themselves, and that was here in Cairo, when the Fatimids arrived. The Fatimids took their name from Fatima, Muhammad's favourite daughter, the mother of Hussein. They too claimed descent from the Prophet, and these Fatimids built Cairo from scratch. There was nothing here when they arrived, and apparently they called their new capital Al-Qahira, the Conqueror, after the planet Mars, which was in the ascendancy when they got here. Some would say the planet Mars has been in the ascendancy around here ever since. The Fatimids were a revolutionary force in Islamic art. They changed many things. Here at the Azhar Mosque, bang in the heart of Cairo, they built a cluster of colleges devoted to the pursuit of knowledge. It was the world's first university, founded in 972. Yes, 972. The Fatimids were particularly keen on education as a way of spreading the Shiite theology and gaining extra converts in secret. It's a different route to power, and some still employ it. See these arches? Keel-shaped they're called. Those were a Fatimid invention. Cairo is particularly good for arches. That mosque with the spiral minaret has pointed arches, superb pointed arches. They weren't an Islamic invention. The Sassanids had used them already, but Islam developed and popularized the pointed arch, and then passed it westwards so that the Gothic age could happen. Gothic owes so much to Islam. I love these spaces, these forests of columns. This is called the hypostyle type of mosque, which basically means that it has lots and lots of columns supporting a flat roof. It's a very simple way of building, descended directly from that portico in the Prophet's courtyard, where the palm trees and the thatch gave his followers somewhere to shelter from the sun. This does exactly the same. see here, where the mihrab is, a small dome, a widening, because almost despite itself, Islam was developing a need to mark its most holy wall more grandly. It's a tendency we'll be keeping an eye on, because this need to rise up to dizzy heights becomes one of the key issues in Islamic architecture. Among the most famous of all Quranic verses is the one inscribed most often on mosque lamps. It's called the light verse, Surah 24:35. God is the light of heaven and earth. The similitude of his light is a niche in the wall. The glass appears as if it were a shining star.
We know this is royal. It was made for Sultan Barkuk, Egyptian ruler. We know the date, which is about 1385.
It's dated, is it?
It's toward the end of, no, we know when he ruled. That's why we know the date.
And this would hang just in front...
Either in the mosque or in the house. But they call it mosque lamp because that is the description that was given when it was produced. But it didn't mean that it was specifically used in the mosque. It was probably was used in probably homes and palaces too. And that there were chains coming from here, holding this. And most of the time, they had a ball, which was like an ostrich egg, sitting on the top of the lamp. And there was always a question, how come they needed to have an ostrich-shaped glass bowl sitting between the chain that connected the lamp to the ceiling? And usually, obviously, they had candle inside. The reason was that they didn't want to have animals falling into it.
I see.
So if
that's where you collected the flies.
That's correct. Or
and
flies,
the moths.
sometimes maybe mice. They fall outside of the lamp rather than falling into.
That's excellently practical.
Yeah.
Can you imagine this though, with a candle inside flickering?
Thinking that this is only 700 years old.
Egypt has a special relationship with precious stones. You know those stories of Cleopatra's fabulous emerald mines? Well, they're not stories. Cleopatra really did have fabulous emerald mines, and she was an ancient Egyptian connoisseur of the sparkling gemstone, as were the Fatimids. The most precious and magical of all Fatimid treasures were actually made from the most abundant mineral on Earth. Scientists, who have their own miraculous ways of calculating these things, tell us that 12% of the Earth's crust is made of quartz. And quartz, in its clearest form, is called rock crystal. They don't mine it around here anymore, but they used to. It was as common in the deserts of Egypt as sand. Actually, it basically was sand, silicon dioxide. But the craftsmen of the Fatimids worked great magic with rock crystal. They took blocks of it, much larger than this, and carved away the insides until the walls of their rock crystal ewers and drinking glasses were as thin as paper. Crystals, like these, are of course what crystal balls used by fortune tellers used to be made from. And crystals always had this otherworldly aspect. The actual word comes from the Greek kristallos, which means ice. And the ancients believed this really was divine ice, trapped in the mountains, waiting to be revealed. And all this superstitious history, this magic air, brought extra sparkle to the rock crystal masterpieces of the Fatimids. There's something else about rock crystal, something even more pertinent than its delicate beauty and its mystical air. According to the Quran, the goblets passed around among the faithful in paradise are also carved of rock crystal. We've changed countries. We're in Iran, or Persia as it used to be known. And if you're ever assailed by doubts about Islam's contribution to the arts, if anyone ever asks you, what have the Muslims done for us? Get yourself here on a sunny day. Hunt down a taxi and head for Gombad-e-Kavus. Ask there for the tomb of Amor Kabus Ibn Vashingir. You can't possibly miss it. When do you think that was built? 1950s? 30s? The 18th century? The 15th century? The 13th? Actually, it was finished in 1006. It's 1,000 years old. When this was built, William the Conqueror hadn't even been born. The chief religion around here before the coming of Islam was Zoroastrianism. It's still the oldest surviving faith in the world. The Zoroastrians built these tall towers for their dead, on which vultures would swoop and pick clean the corpse's bones. It's a highly efficient avian hygiene. And these Zoroastrian death towers influenced the look and the mood of some extremely unlikely Islamic architecture that's dotted all along the Caspian coast. This spectacular and unlikely tomb was built by a formidable local Renaissance man, Amir Kabus Ibn Vashingir, poet, scholar, calligrapher, astrologer, chess player, and ruthless regional warlord. Ibn Vashingir ruled Gombad for 40 years. And when he began to suspect that his time might be up, he built this great mausoleum for himself here on the edge of the Turkoman steppe. It was built to be indestructible. It's 170 feet tall, and there's another 35 feet hidden from sight underground in the foundations. It's a masterpiece of unexpected minimalism, so sparse. Those razor-sharp edges, flanges they're called, go all the way around the building. They're made from desert bricks, and they cut the shadows up into thin stripes and then spend the whole day rearranging them. That's all that goes on here, but it's enough. And I like that cheeky conical cap that tops it off so perfectly. Ibn Vashingir was assassinated 6 years after his great tower was finished. His enemies tied him up in the snow at nearby Gorgon and watched him freeze to death. But he was buried as he wanted to be, his body suspended from the tower roof in a see-through coffin made of rock crystal. There's a tiny window up there, and every time the sun rose, a shaft of light would penetrate the darkness of the tower and illuminate Ebner Vashingir's crystal coffin. I'm not sure I can think of a more exciting way to die. I'm still in Iran, where I've come to the tomb of the Ayatollah Khomeini to gather my thoughts and set myself some priorities. If you can't gather your thoughts here, where can you gather them? This film has a simple proposition: that Islam has given the world some of its most beautiful things. We tend these days to forget that. We tend to let transient stuff like politics elbow out the ancient truths. So I wanted to read some poetry in here. British soldiers used to recite this to themselves in the First World War as they marched to their deaths on the Western Front. And our grandparents used to know large chunks of this by heart. It's by the 11th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam, and it captures so perfectly the fragility of Khayyam's times, indeed, of everyone's times. Strange is it not that of the myriads who before us passed the door of darkness through, not one returns to tell us of the road which to discover we must travel too. Yesterday this day's madness did prepare, tomorrow's silence, triumph or despair. Drink, for you know not whence you came, nor why. Drink, for you know not why you go, nor where. Life is short. Sultans, presidents and ayatollahs come and go, but there's a beauty out there that can always be relied upon, a bigger beauty that Islamic art wants always to reflect and match. This film is about that quest. The trouble is that, like so many things in Islam, this elusive beauty keeps changing. The Islamic Empire was packed with far too many different types of international creative ever to arrive at a consensus. Isfahan, on the hot edges of the Persian desert, was a particularly busy trading city which everyone tried to grab. For 200 years, it was controlled by the Seljuks. They lost it to the Mongols. Then the Timurids took over. Finally, Isfahan fell to the Safavids, who ruled here in the 16th century, and whose artistic achievements were surprisingly frisky.
Beste kijkers, beste luisteraars. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Vrede zij met u allen. Mogen de genade van de Almachtige en zijn zegeningen op u allen rusten. We hebben onlangs het Eid al-Fitr-feest gehad. Dat was op 13 mei jongstleden. En daaraan voorafgaand hebben we gehad de vaste maand Ramadan. Wel bekende vaste maand van 29 of 30 dagen. Die was begonnen op 13 april en is geëindigd op 12 mei. En dat was dus de 9e maand van de islamitische kalender, de Ramadan. En op de eerste dag van de volgende maand, de 10e maand Shawwal, wordt dan het Eid al-Fitr feest gevierd. Het feest van verbreken van het vasten. Net als de westerse kalender die we allemaal kennen, heeft ook de islamitische kalender 12 maanden. Alleen zijn de maanden iets korter, 29 of 30 dagen zijn die. Waardoor ook het islamitisch jaar iets korter is dan het westers jaar. En zodoende begint de Ramadan dus elk jaar steeds ongeveer 10 tot 11 dagen eerder dan het jaar daarvoor. Over het doel van het vasten zegt de Koran in hoofdstuk 2 vers 183 dat het vasten is voorgeschreven zodat wij ons voor het kwaad kunnen hoeden. Het niet eten en niet drinken de hele dag door is eigenlijk een herinnering de hele dag door dat we van verkeerde daden wegblijven. En nu is de Ramadan afgelopen en dan kunnen we ons afvragen: alles wat we in de Ramadan hebben meegekregen, is dat nu voorbij? Het wegblijven van verkeerde daden, is dat nu voorbij? Het extra hulp geven aan armen en behoeftigen, is dat nu voorbij? Extra liefdadigheid verrichten. Moeten we nu weer back to normal, zoals we zo vaak horen, terug naar normaal? Terug naar de situatie voor de Ramadan, waarbij we weer ons bezig gaan houden met feesten, met zuipen, met onderdrukken van anderen, met corruptie, vriendjespolitiek, gokken, machtsmisbruik, liegen en bedriegen. Is dat de bedoeling na de Ramadan? Mocht dat zo zijn, dan hebben we eigenlijk niks meegekregen van de 30 dagen vasten. Het is juist de bedoeling dat we met de ervaringen die we hebben opgedaan een nieuw normaal creëren. Een nieuw begin, een nieuw leven, waar we de goede zaken die we in de Ramadan hebben gedaan, meenemen in de komende periode. Waar nodig, waar mogelijk, anderen blijven ondersteunen. Zij die misschien de dagelijkse gebeden niet hadden gedaan eerder en in de Ramadan wel. Het is een bewijs dat u de discipline kunt opbrengen om dat te doen. En blijft u dat dan ook vooral doen, voor uw eigen welzijn. Het probleem is echter dat de mens van nature op bepaalde gebieden zwak is geschapen. Zoals we lezen in de Koran, hoofdstuk 95. Voorzeker hebben wij de mens in de beste vorm geschapen, zegt Allah dus. Vervolgens brengen wij hem terug tot de laagste der lagen. Behalve degenen die geloven en goede werken doen, zij zullen een nimmer af te snijden beloning hebben. Einde citaat. Het vers is duidelijk. De menselijke geest neigt maar al te vaak tot het slechte. En we hebben echt bewust een intentie ervoor nodig. Bewust eraan werken als we echt goed willen doen. Misschien gelooft u het niet. Pakt u uw mobiel en maakt u een kleine opname van dit programma. En dan zet u dat op Facebook met de ondertiteling Woord van God. En dan gaan we kijken hoeveel likes en hoeveel shares dat programma krijgt. En de volgende dag, dan pakt u iets wat er ergens misgegaan is in de samenleving. Iemand die misschien vanwege zenuw een beetje vals heeft gezongen. En dan zet u dat ook op Facebook. En dan gaan we kijken welke van die twee meer likes en meer shares gaat krijgen. Of u dat nou probeert of niet, u weet nu al wat de uitkomst zal zijn. De religieuze boodschap, die zal veel minder hard lopen, helaas, dan datgene waarop mensen kiek kunnen nemen. Als we anderen kunnen uitlachen, leedvermaak, dat loopt veel harder, helaas. En dat is wat de Koran ook zegt. De mens is van nature zwak geschapen, behalve degenen die geloven en goede daden doen. En wat ik net al zei, het vergt een extra inspanning van ons. Als we iets verkeerds zien langskomen, om dat te laten waar het is. Geen aandacht aan te geven en vooral niet verder te gaan delen. En als we iets goeds zien langskomen, wat we normaal zouden laten liggen, laten we proberen juist zulke zaken onder aandacht van de mensen te brengen. Het mooie is dat niet alleen de moslims deze gereedschappen van de Almachtige hebben gekregen om zichzelf te verbeteren. Gereedschappen als gebed en vasten. Elke religie heeft deze gereedschappen in zich. We kennen bijvoorbeeld in de Hindoe-traditie Navratin-periode 2 keer per jaar, 9 dagen vasten. Ook een methode tot spirituele groei en verheffing. We kennen ook in de christelijke traditie de 40-daagse vastenperiode voor het paasfeest. Ook bij de Joodse broeders en zusters hebben we dergelijke vastenperiodes. Dus je ziet, het zijn allemaal methodes om onszelf te verbeteren. En niet alleen maar om in die specifieke periodes goed te doen, maar datgene wat we in die periode meekrijgen, blijven uitdragen de rest van het jaar, de rest van ons leven eigenlijk. Tot slot dus, wat wij met deze boodschap willen meegeven, is dat we de hoogtijmomenten nemen als inspiratie. Vele van de hoogtijmomenten zijn vastgelegd in nationale feestdagen. En het is niet de bedoeling dat de nationale feestdag van de ene religieuze groep, waar iedereen vrij is, alleen door mensen van die groep wordt gevierd of herdacht. En dat de rest, zeg maar, een dagje uitgaat of gaat feesten en dergelijke. Het doel van de religieuze feestdagen, de nationale vrijdagen, dat is dat wij allemaal als samenleving de boodschap die deze dagen met zich meebrengen, tot ons nemen als momenten van bezinning. En dat we daar allemaal, ongeacht onze eigen religieuze achtergrond, inspiratie uithalen om het goede uit te dragen, om het goede te blijven doen. Tot slot, hoofdstuk 103 uit de Koran. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wal asr, innal insana lafi khusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Vertaling. Bij de tijd, waarlijk, de mens is in verlies. Behalve degenen die geloven en goede werken doen en elkaar aansporen tot waarheid en elkaar aansporen tot geduld. Amen. Einde citaat. Mogen wij allemaal tot deze groep behoren, die geloven, ongeacht welke religie u beleidt, die geloven, goede daden doen, elkaar aansporen tot waarheid en elkaar aansporen tot geduld. Dit was een boodschap namens de Surinaamse Islamitische Vereniging. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Vrede zijn met u allen.